They expected punishment, not plates. When the camp gates opened that night, the women braced for another inspection. Instead, they saw lanterns, tables, steam rising from real food. "Take a seat," an American officer said kindly, motioning toward the long wooden benches. The German women didn't move. Their stomachs growled, but their hands shook harder. For years, they'd been taught that the enemy had no mercy. Yet here it was, steaming, silent, waiting. One whispered, "It's a trick." Another murmured, "No, it smells like Christmas." That night, they would learn that war can feed hatred, but sometimes mercy serves the last course. Winter, 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but inside Camp Hearn, Texas, the war still lived quietly. In memory, in hunger, and in silence. Rows of barracks stretched across the cold field like forgotten shadows. Inside, German women prisoners huddled near small stoves, warming their hands over thin coffee in thicker regret. They were not soldiers. Most had been nurses, telegraph operators, translators, swept into the tide of war and washed up here, thousands of miles from home. For months, their world had been predictable. Roll call, rations, labor, and distrust. Heavy, constant, like the Texas dust that never left their clothes. That night began like any other, until the lights went out. The floodlights that had guarded every inch of wire flickered, hummed, and fell dark. A single sound followed. The crack of a match, the glow of a lantern, then another, and another. The women stepped out of their barracks in confusion. Down the main road, American soldiers were setting lanterns along long wooden tables. Tables that hadn't been there hours earlier. Steam rose from large metal pots. The air carried smells no one had sensed in years. Roasted meat, fresh bread, coffee. They froze. Liesel, nervously. "Is it Christmas?" Marta, grimly. "Not for us." Then came the voice, deep, kind, almost casual. An American officer stepped forward, coat unbuttoned, smiling faintly. "Officer, ladies, tonight, there's no work detail. Dinner's on us." The women stared, stunned into silence. Anna, whispering, "Dinner? For us?" Liesel, "It's a trick. They want to see how far we'll crawl for a meal." No one moved. For years, they'd been told that Americans were savages, men who would punish, not feed. But the smell in the air was real, and the warmth that spread across the cold camp was unmistakable. One soldier pulled out a chair and gestured gently. "Guard, please." Sit still. No one dared. The moment stretched painfully long, a silent standoff between fear and hunger. Finally, Marta, the oldest among them, stepped forward. She looked at the food, then at the young American with kind eyes. "Marta, if this is poison," she muttered, "then let it be the sweetest kind." She sat down. The bench creaked, and the spell broke. One by one, the women followed, slowly, awkwardly, as though expecting the floor to open beneath them. Plates were filled, coffee poured. They came to the table like prisoners, but for the first time in years, they felt like guests. The benches creaked beneath uneasy bodies. Steam drifted upward, curling like ghosts above the table. No one spoke. Spoons hovered midair, hands trembling from cold and caution. For a long moment, they only stared at the food: mashed potatoes, roasted meat, soft bread that smelled faintly of butter. It looked too generous, too unreal, like a photograph from another lifetime. Anna's stomach twisted. She hadn't seen a meal like this since before the bombings in Bremen. Her mother used to roast meat on Sundays, back when laughter came easier than fear. Now, across the ocean, that same smell filled a prison camp. Marta sat at the far end of the table, her spine straight, her face unreadable. She reached for a piece of bread, broke it, and whispered something that sounded like grace. Then she ate, one slow bite, eyes closing as if waiting for pain. Nothing happened, only silence. Then she nodded. "It's real," she said softly. "It's just food." That simple sentence spread through the table like fire through dry grass. Spoons scraped plates. Someone laughed. A sound so sudden it startled everyone. Then more laughter, more tears, and a quiet relief that felt like breathing after years underwater. A young American soldier stood nearby, his rifle slung lazily at his shoulder. When he saw one of the women hiding bread inside her sleeve, he didn't stop her. Instead, he took another slice and placed it gently beside her plate. Their eyes met for a second. No words, just the kind of understanding that doesn't need translation. Across the table, Liesel whispered, "Why are they doing this?" "We're their enemies," Anna answered. "Maybe they forgot." Plates passed from hand to hand, coffee cups refilled. Someone began humming a German lullaby, and for once, no guard silenced it. The camp that once smelled of dust and fear now carried the warmth of broth and bread. One woman started to cry, not because of sadness, but because she could taste salt that wasn't from tears. Another murmured, "It feels like home, but it isn't." For the Americans, it was just dinner. For the women, it was the first time in years they'd been treated as people instead of prisoners. When the meal ended, Marta raised her cup slightly and said, "To the ones who feed their enemies, may their children never know war." The soldier beside her smiled, unsure what she'd said, but somehow he understood. That night, the camp glowed with lantern light and quiet voices. Behind every barbed wire shadow, something human flickered back to life. Trust. But as the fires dimmed and silence returned, Anna couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling, whispering to herself, "If kindness exists here, then everything we were told was a lie." The thought terrified her, and somehow it also made her heart ache with hope. Morning crept into the camp softly, painting the barbed wire gold. For the first time in months, the women didn't wake to orders, but to the smell of something sweet. A faint aroma drifted through the yard. Coffee, real coffee, and warm bread reheated on metal trays. Anna stepped outside, clutching her tin cup. The Americans were already at work, cleaning, whistling, laughing in a language that sounded lighter than theirs. She had expected mockery after last night's dinner, but there was none. Only quiet nods, brief smiles, and the steady rhythm of normal life. Liesel sat on a bench, staring at her hands. "I dreamt it," she muttered. Marta shook her head. "No dream lasts that long." Then she added, "I remember the taste." It was real. The other women joined them, sharing small pieces of leftover bread they had saved in handkerchiefs. They didn't eat it. Not yet. They only held it, inhaling the smell as if trying to memorize peace. At the far side of the yard, an American soldier was fixing a broken fence post. He wasn't shouting or pointing a gun, just working with quiet patience. Anna watched him for a while before whispering, "They don't hate us," Marta replied. "No, they just don't know us." Later that afternoon, the guards brought boxes to the main hall. Inside, scraps of paper, pencils, and small books. An officer explained through a translator that they could learn English, read newspapers, even write letters home. The room fell silent. It was too much, too generous, too impossible. Helga, who rarely spoke, said, "They feed us, teach us, let us write. It feels like they're trying to make us forget we lost." Liesel answered, "Maybe they're trying to make us remember we're human." In the evening, as the sun bled into the Texas sky, a young soldier sat outside the wire with a harmonica. He began to play, soft, uncertain notes that floated through the camp. One of the women recognized the tune. She started humming along, barely audible. Soon others joined her, voices fragile but pure. For a few moments there were no prisoners, no guards, just a song crossing the wire like a bridge. When the tune ended, the soldier looked up, surprised. Anna smiled at him. He nodded once, then began playing again, louder this time. Marta whispered, "If my husband could see this, he wouldn't believe it." Anna replied quietly, "Neither would mine." The women went to bed that night full, not from food, but from something they had forgotten existed. Before falling asleep, Anna wrote on a scrap of paper she'd hidden under her pillow. "Maybe mercy is not weakness. Maybe it's how peace begins." She folded the note carefully, the corners crisp and deliberate, as if she were folding a flag for a new world she didn't yet understand. Days began to pass differently after that dinner. The fences were still there, but the silence between the guards and the prisoners had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, cautious, almost human. The women worked in the camp gardens now, tending rows of vegetables that would feed both sides. They spoke quietly while their hands dug through warm soil. Liesel joked that the earth here felt fatter than in Germany, full of life instead of ashes. Even laughter began to sound normal again. At midday, when the sun burned overhead, the Americans sometimes passed them cold water or an apple. No one refused it anymore. Every small act chipped away at the wall, built by years of propaganda and fear. Anna had started to teach a few of them English phrases she'd picked up from guards. Thank you. Please. Good morning. They practiced shyly, giggling when they got the accent wrong. When one of the soldiers heard them, he laughed too. Not cruelly, but warmly. It made them laugh harder. It was strange how joy could survive in a place built for captivity. That evening, the smell of cooking drifted from the camp kitchen again. This time richer, sweeter. The women stood at the door trying to guess what it was. Inside, the cooks, all American, were stirring large pots and laughing. The same officer from the first dinner appeared, holding something wrapped carefully in a white cloth. When he placed it on the table, the room fell silent. He lifted the cloth. A chocolate cake. Dark, glossy, and perfect. The women gasped. Some stepped back. Others began to cry. Chocolate. They hadn't tasted it since before the bombings. Since childhood. No one moved until Marta whispered, "It smells like peace." The officer sliced the cake into even pieces and gestured for them to come forward. Hands shook as they accepted the plates. No speeches, no orders. Just a quiet invitation to remember what kindness tasted like. When Anna took her first bite, tears welled in her eyes. It wasn't just sweetness. It was memory. Her mother's voice. Her sister's laughter. For a moment, war disappeared. Around the table, women smiled through tears. Some closed their eyes to hide them. Others laughed through trembling lips. They were not celebrating victory. They were rediscovering life. Later, as they walked back to the barracks, Marta said softly, "If they can feed us like this, maybe the world isn't beyond repair." Anna nodded. "Maybe it's starting again, right here." But just as they began to believe in that fragile peace, a jeep rolled through the gates the next morning, carrying something unexpected. The driver held a small leather bag marked Red Cross. Inside were letters, real letters, from home, and the camp fell silent once again. The jeep stopped beside the command office, its tires crunching over gravel. The driver climbed out, carrying a Red Cross satchel in both hands as if it were made of glass. He said a few quiet words to the American captain, who nodded slowly, and then called for everyone to gather. The women dropped what they were doing, buckets, tools, brushes, everything forgotten. A rumor spread faster than wind. "Mail," someone whispered, "real mail. From home." They ran toward the yard, breathless. For months they'd written letters that vanished into silence. No answers ever came. Most had stopped hoping. But now, in that dusty Texas morning, hope had a sound. Paper rustling, envelopes being counted. The captain stood on a crate and began to read names. Anna Vogel. The sound of her own name hit her like a bullet and a blessing all at once. She froze. For a second, she didn't believe he'd said it. When he called again, she stepped forward, trembling. The envelope he handed her was thin, its corners worn, the ink slightly smudged, but unmistakably real, her mother's handwriting. She pressed it to her chest before tearing it open. Inside were only a few lines. "My dear Anna, the house is gone, but the lilac tree still blooms. I pray every night you are safe. If this finds you, remember, the world can fall apart, but love endures." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. For the first time in years, her mother's voice lived again. All around her, cries rose and fell like waves. Some women laughed. Others sank to their knees, clutching envelopes as if they were oxygen. One woman shouted, "He's alive!" Another whispered, My children wrote back." Liesel's hands shook so badly she couldn't open her letter. Marta helped her, her own cheeks streaked with tears. Inside was a photograph, a husband in uniform, smiling faintly. standing beside a rebuilt wall. He had survived. It wasn't all joy. Greta's letter came with bad news. Her father gone, her home burned. Yet even through the grief, she smiled through tears and said, "He died knowing I lived." For hours the camp buzzed with life. Letters were read aloud, traded, kissed, and clutched. They spoke in fragments, mixing English, German, and emotion. Even the guards smiled quietly, pretending not to notice their own tears. As the sun began to set, Anna looked around and whispered, "They fed us. Now they've given us back our voices." Marta replied, "And maybe our forgiveness too." That night, not one of them slept. The air was alive with whispers, stories, names, promises, the sound of 100 hearts remembering home. And as the lanterns flickered in the dark, someone said, "If they can send our letters across oceans, maybe they can send our hope too." The next morning, another truck arrived. But this one didn't bring food or mail. It brought an order. Prepare for departure. The camp would soon be gone. Freedom was coming, and no one knew what it would taste like. The order spread through the camp like a cold wind. Repatriation. Within days, the women would be leaving. Some rejoiced quietly, others grew still. Home, the word had changed meaning. It wasn't a place anymore, but a memory stitched together from letters and fading photographs. 2 nights before their departure, the Americans announced a final gathering. No one knew what to expect. Maybe a speech, maybe silence. But as evening fell, the scent of roasted vegetables and bread drifted from the kitchen again. Lanterns hung between barracks, glowing against the twilight. Tables stretched across the yard like the first night, only now the seats were mixed. Germans and Americans side by side. There were no rifles, no barriers. Just food, laughter, and the low hum of conversation. Anna sat beside the same young guard who had once offered her bread in silence. He smiled awkwardly and said, "You'll be home soon." She nodded, unsure how to answer. Marta lifted her cup and spoke softly. "To kindness. May it survive longer than wars." The translation took a moment, but when the officer understood, he raised his glass too. "To peace that feeds everyone." They all drank. Soon laughter began to replace hesitation. Helga showed a photograph of her son, the boy who had sent her the drawing weeks earlier. The guard beside her passed around a picture of his sister, the same age. They compared smiles and freckles. The women gasped softly when they saw how young she was, how much like any German child she looked. The officer encouraged them to eat freely. The table filled with vegetables, stew, coffee, and something none of them expected. A small decorated cake with white icing. It wasn't grand, but the gesture carried more weight than words could. Anna took a slice slowly, savoring every bite. She looked across the table and whispered, "If we had sat like this years ago, maybe the world would have never burned." The soldier beside her nodded. "Maybe. But maybe this is how it begins again." When darkness fell completely, one of the Americans pulled out a guitar. He began playing softly, an old song about home. To everyone's surprise, Marta started humming along, then singing in German. Her voice trembled but didn't break. Soon others joined her, both sides, blending languages into one melody that didn't belong to any country. When the song ended, there were tears on nearly every face. No speeches followed, no commands, just silence. Deep, beautiful, human. Anna folded her napkin carefully like a keepsake and whispered, "They fed us like we mattered." I don't know what that makes us now. Enemies, guests, or simply people. Marta answered softly, "It makes us alive." The next morning the buses would come. The fences would open. But that night under the soft Texas stars, they didn't belong to any flag, only to the memory of mercy shared over bread. Morning came with the sound of engines. The buses lined up along the dirt road outside the camp, their white paint glinting under the Texas sun. The barbed wire gates, once symbols of confinement, now hung open. The women stood in small groups, their belongings wrapped neatly in brown cloth or tied with twine. No one spoke much. There was joy, yes, but also a quiet sorrow for something they didn't know they'd grown to cherish. the kindness of their captors. Anna touched the bundle in her hands, a few clothes, a small diary, and the letters she'd guarded like treasure. Inside one of them was a folded napkin from the farewell dinner, still faintly smelling of coffee. Liesel turned to her and said, "It's strange, isn't it? We came here as enemies, and we're leaving with full stomachs and American songs in our heads." Marta smiled faintly. War changes the world, but sometimes peace does too. At the gate, the American officers stood waiting. Their uniforms were clean, pressed, almost ceremonial, yet their faces carried the weight of goodbye. Each woman stepped forward in turn, saluting awkwardly or bowing slightly. No one knew the proper gesture for gratitude between enemies. When Anna reached the young guard who had once given her extra bread, she froze for a second, then held out her hand. He took it gently, eyes soft. "You'll rebuild," he said. "I know you will." She nodded. "You too. Build something better than fences." He smiled. "We'll try." As the buses started to fill, the women pressed their faces to the windows. The Americans waved, some raising hands, others simply standing still. A few of the women wept openly now, clutching the letters that had brought their old lives back to life. When the convoy moved, the camp began to shrink in the distance. The towers, the fences, the lantern poles. But none of it looked like a prison anymore. It looked like a place where something impossible had happened. Mercy had taken root in the ashes of hate. The buses rumbled through quiet Texas towns. Children waved from porches, shouting words the women didn't understand but somehow felt. An old woman by the roadside crossed herself as they passed, and one of the prisoners whispered, "She blesses us." Days later, they boarded a ship bound for Europe. The ocean stretched endless and gray. Many stood on deck, watching the coastline disappear. Not as captives leaving their cage, but as witnesses to something gentler than victory. Anna wrote one final entry in her diary that night. "I used to believe freedom was something you took. Now I know it can be something given. The Americans said, 'Take a seat, dinner's on us.' They didn't just feed us. They showed us that humanity doesn't choose sides. It just needs a table." She looked up at the stars, the same sky her mother would see on the other side of the ocean, and smiled. When they reached Bremen, nothing looked the same. Buildings lay shattered, streets turned to rubble. But in every ruin, life had begun to stir. Children running barefoot, old women planting flowers among the stones. Anna stepped off the truck, clutching her letters. She would rebuild, not just walls, but faith. Because she had learned something that no bomb could destroy. Compassion could survive anything. Years later, she would tell her daughter the story of the night the enemy offered her a seat at the table. The girl would listen, eyes wide, then ask, "Mama, did you forgive them?" Anna would smile softly. "I didn't need to," she'd say. "They forgave me first, with food." And the daughter would never forget it, because that's how the world truly began again. Not with treaties or flags, but with one meal shared between those who once believed they'd never sit together.